Welcome into the Fantasy Football Lab. I'm Arlen, and this is Nate here. How you doing, Nate?
Doing great, man. Ready to get into this thing.
Nice. This is going to be one of my favorites, I'm sure. I'm super excited about this one. This is a defining moment of the change that we had within our podcast, and we wanted to kind of bring some different stuff here. One of them is the history of fantasy football. So we'll get into that in a minute, but this is what we'll be covering. The main portion of the show today is the origin story of fantasy football itself.
Welcome to the Fantasy Football Lab.
Woo! But first, before we jump into that, and we will start with the origin story, and this is going to be one of a series in general. I just kind of want to go through the progression of fantasy football throughout the years and kind of how it changed with football and how it changed with technology, the advancement of the internet and how that changed fantasy football, how we got here. And then we'll have different segments along the way of kind of going back. We'll go in a linear way, and then we'll kind of go back on a couple of how did fantasy football with PPR start? How did there's different changes throughout them throughout the years itself. So we'll go through in a linear way, and then we'll go back and hit a couple more more specifically. But first, let's pause and say we are filming this right after the dynasty has been kind of slapped around a little bit. The Chiefs lost to the Eagles in a way that will be forgotten in history because the final score does not tell the story
It does
of
not.
the whole game.
No.
No, it doesn't. I was happy to see it. What about you?
Yeah, it was an exciting game. Normally, you don't want to see blowouts in a Super Bowl. Playoffs with huge blowouts and things like that are
Right.
usually pretty boring. I was hosting a bunch of teenage boys. My son, my 15-year-old son. I better explain that before I move on. My 15-year-old son had invited a bunch of his friends over to the
Sure.
house
Yeah.
to watch the game. So we were watching it together, and it was like whatever, 24-0 at halftime. I was like, "Do you guys?" I'm really enjoying this because I love
Yeah.
watching Patrick Mahomes scramble and
Yeah.
sack and live on the ground in the backfield over and over again. That's great. But if you guys want to go to the park or something, feel free.
Yeah.
Um,
And then
because
speaking of, you had your yeah, and I think we texted even during it. I usually don't like these blowout Super Bowls, but for this one, you're taking it to the man.
yeah,
It's it's the classic quintessential dynasty team here, and we get to watch them get slapped around a little bit with one of the most lovable players in Barkley, who didn't have an historic game, but no doubtedly had an historic fantasy football
season.
season,
Yeah,
NFL season, and led them to this point so that they could jump on it like this. So it was really cool. I was really happy to see that for him. I think I was
yeah,
happiest for him, um, and AJ Brown and those players that have been fighting for a while for something.
right. And this game specifically, it ended in such a way that I was super happy for the Eagles. Happy they won. Happy Jalen got it. But I think I would have been so hurt and offended if the Chiefs found a way to eke it out and get their third because
Yeah,
the Chiefs were not the Chiefs this year. Like we watched them. There's past years where they had bad regular seasons or early regular
last year
seasons, and then
wasn't
they
amazing, but it was definitely this
right.
one was
Last year wasn't
historically
amazing,
close. Every game could have been flipped, and they would have been four
right?
wins.
And last year it wasn't amazing, but they turned on. You could tell when they turned on the playoff switch
Yeah, yeah,
as
yeah,
they got
totally.
closer.
That's a good.
This year, that didn't feel like it happened. They were still eking by
Yeah,
in their playoff games. So had they won it and got their way through it and gotten their dynasty on this team, I think I would have I don't know. I say this every year at the end of the fantasy season. I'm like, I need to take a break from fantasy. I might have been like, I need to take a break from NFL for a little bit. I need a couple months
yeah,
off.
yeah. I think that's fair, and I think you said it right too. It's at every year or the last few years, it's been they've, especially last year, I felt where it was during the regular season, the Chiefs were underwhelming, and the year before, but last year was like underwhelming. And then you think, well, maybe they can't. They just won it. Who wins it twice? Like they look really weak. They lost some pieces, and then they get into the playoffs, and it was like they were conserving their energy for the playoffs because they knew they were going to be in the playoffs. And
Right.
this year, it felt like that switch just never happened, and somehow they still got forward. They move forward and forward and forward, and they're in the Super Bowl, and this prolific team is against them. I'm like, if this does not work, then I am going to lose a little hope for the NFL itself.
For the rest of the NFL.
Yeah, no, totally. All right, but on the last throw, you had a win in our playoff fantasy football.
Yeah, I was going to talk about
so
this.
I want to give you a shout out for it. So you had a win on the Xavier Worthy bomb touchdown that was a complete garbage time, and I didn't go back. I was already out of it at this point. So you've probably done the math. How far were you down, and how much did you win by? And this is a 4-team. We talked about it last, so I won't go into it too deep. So if you want to hear about some, like, the last episode we did, we talked about some fantasy NFL playoff fantasy football that you can do. There's 2 options: large ones where you can choose to invite or not invite some friends, and then there's the smaller ones, and it's 4 teams. So this is the 4 team, and I think that got you the win. How did that happen? What were the points like?
Yeah, so it was pretty tight. He had actually really helped me out after his first touchdown, but I ended up, I believe, winning only by 7 points at the end of the whole thing. Which that last touchdown really saved me because my other player in the game was Barkley, and he, as you called out, was not having an unbelievable game. Sorry, inaccurate. I won by 27 points. So I guess I did a little bit better than I thought. But I just
you won anyways.
Yeah, I won anyway. But it was still nice. It was still nice.
Yeah.
To guarantee it because I just checked. But Barkley wasn't doing that great, so I was actually getting nervous because I went into the game not having a lead, and my players were. I felt pretty good having Barkley and Worthy going into it, but then with Barkley not showing up, he got sub 12 points. I think he got 11 points total in that game. Which is not what you expected from Barkley the whole season through. Xavier Worthy easily could, with how the Chiefs were performing, easily could have had a really bad game and killed me. But he had a lights out game. So yeah, I won by 27 points, but I don't think anyone was expecting Xavier Worthy to go off the way that he did. He got me 35 points. So I'll take it.
That's huge. I didn't know it ended up with that many. So we'll get into the history in a second. I kind of threw that out there because, of course, we've got to talk about the end of it. But I do want to just put a placeholder in here because I'm excited. This week we start our other football love, which is it's such a perfect handoff where there's such a complaint in the MLS community that we don't have a regular schedule. Which with our weather, I don't really think we can. We need the summer, and we need MLS to start now. And you and I are MLS fans, and this is a perfect handoff to football. So we end the Super Bowl, and it's last week, and then this coming weekend is the home opener. I am a season ticket holder of the Timbers for years. You are a season ticket holder of the new Welcome to the League, San Diego Is it San Diego Football Club? Is that how the proper?
San Diego Football Club. Yep.
Welcome to the league,
SDFC.
Man. Is your first game at home?
No, our first game's against LA on the 23rd. So our first
that's
game
really
is
rude.
On the first. Yeah.
That's really rude that they didn't give the new team a home game to start it.
So our second game's at home.
Okay, cool.
But we'll get to watch the first game, I guess, on TV.
Good. Well, welcome to the league, man. I'm excited. I love the MLS, and I know that this is a football and fantasy football, but I love the MLS, and it's exciting that you and I both are into it, so we can keep a West Coast rivalry. I think the decision day this year is against you.
Yeah. So, expansion team. Don't know what you're going to get. We can get a amazing season out of this first year, or we could lose quite a bit. Either way, we do get to play. I think our first, you got us in the preseason in that game. I think 3-0 a few days ago. But I believe I've circled, highlighted, and underlined August 23rd is when we're playing for real.
Yep. And then decision day is not to be like, I think it is decision day itself. That is, it's not to be trifled with. So in the MLS, if you're not familiar with decision day, it is a lot of times it's tighter. It's pretty tight at the end. And if you're a upper half team, like skill wise, then you're battling sometimes at the end for placement or qualification. And so that last day, they often, historically, it's like big matchups on that day, decision day. It's the last game of the year. And it says a lot to put the Timbers against San Diego, of just like, it's going to be fun. A historic club versus like the brand new club that has had some pretty strong signings. So it'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, man. It'll be a fun season. Do they do fantasy MLS? I wish they did.
I've looked at it, and I kind of brought that up that's the placeholder part. I kind of want to explore it. There's enough stats there, and no one does it, I don't think. Let's look into it. But first, before we talk about the history of MLS fantasy, if it is a thing or not, let's talk about the history of fantasy football. Oh,
these drops, right, man. I just want to say these drops are dope.
Thank you, man. Thank you. Well, let's put it to the speed of 88. Go back in time, and go back all the way to the 1950s. That's where the story begins. So I had such a fun time digging into fantasy football history and just learning a little bit about it. So I kind of teased this last time we spoke, and it was the fact that like we actually owe quite a bit of fantasy football to fantasy golf, which I don't know if it's a thing or not still. So I should have probably looked that up. I don't know if people do fantasy golf, but this guy named Bill, they called him Bill Winkenbach. He was a partial owner of the Oakland Raiders. And he wanted to kind of figure out some, and at the time it wasn't called fantasy. It was just, but we'll refer to it fantasy football, fantasy golf throughout this. But the term fantasy didn't actually come until like the I think the 80s. And in the 1950s, he started an experiment with golf, and he had fantasy golf where he really wanted to kind of understand how he was playing around with how do we take these real but fictional players and their stats in real life and mix it in so that there's a game that we can play together. So we'll take a look at that. We'll also take a look at like how that transitioned into fantasy football itself. Talking about the first league and giving them their dues and credit throughout this conversation. And then we'll move into also this, like, throughout the series, we'll move into all these different pieces, how it became this like multi-billion-dollar industry. But along the way, the first piece, I definitely want to give credit to the first champions. Talk about how it was structured. What was the scoring system like in the beginning? And that's going to be most of the talk today, of just like, how was it done in the beginning and why did it start? So Bill Winkenbach, the godfather, I think is fair. Again, part owner of the Oakland Raiders, and he was a really big sports fan. So he looked at fantasy golf because at the time it was pretty easy to just kind of choose a golfer, and the stats were kind of out there. Strokes, like par, you have birdie, like extra points for that, and you can do that, and you can create this like this piece here. But the problem with golf versus other sports like football is it just wasn't as wide. widespread, and it wasn't as consistent. It wasn't like this Sunday, every Sunday you're going to have a game. And I think that's what the problem with it was at first. But when I first heard that it was fantasy golf that it started with, it's got to be one of my least favorite. One of my least favorite sport. It makes so much sense, obviously, but I was just like,
yeah, because
golf,
the numbers
really?
are a lot more understandable and
yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, but I get how it works. So he did that in like 58, 59. And he messed around with it for like, I don't know, a few years, and then in 63, which is like about the time when the AFL was starting to pop off, NFL was starting to pop off too, and they were like looking at a possible merger. These were two real leagues. They decided to try fantasy football. And at this time it was kind of funny because they really focused on NFL teams. And if you are a fan of the Raiders, you know that originally they were an AFL team. So there's like a mixed history. There's a mix, like a lot of these facts I found are very much like not fully word of mouth, but it's not like completely confirmed on the early years how it ran. The assumption is that there was at least Raiders players, but a lot of people talked about it was NFL only, even though it was started by a Raiders owner. And I think though that the main assumption is that at least Raiders were in there, and that's how they started it. And that it made sense to do because you're looking at weekly games. It was like a good transition from golf to something that had a little more consistency.
Yeah. One of my favorite things to look up, and sorry, I cheated a little bit. I looked up a little bit of history here.
Please.
Your boy Bill, the minority Raiders owner, started this whole thing because, like, he made this transition because it was in 1962. They were coming into a season where they were 0-13, and Raiders fans were really restless. So they wanted to try to figure out a way to make football watchable.
Yeah.
And I love that for the Raiders. As a Chargers fan, I just wanted to call that out.
No, I think it's a good call out. It was like, because that's how I'm a Browns fan. So that's like at the time when fantasy football started, the Browns were it. They were the golden boys of the leagues. You know, they were dominant force. But I feel as when I started fantasy football, I wanted to look at a way to root for a football team I loved that did really well. And it was my own fantasy football team. It was like, how can we have fun with this sport that we suck at? And I feel like there's a connection there. My first league, in which the trophy stands behind me, started in the same city as this one. It started in Oakland. The first ever league was in Oakland. It was called the, get ready for this long name, it was the Greater Oakland Professional Pigskin Prognosticators League, or for short, GOPPPL. The Greater Oakland Professional Pigskin Prognosticators League.
It's one of those acronyms where I'd rather just not have the acronym.
Right,
The GOP cubed L.
I mean, I think you could say GOPPPL. I'm going to say GOPPPL, right? I think that's fair.
I'll take your word for it.
The GOPPPL. All right, so as they transitioned, golf it wasn't as broad. It wasn't, so they transitioned to football. They get in here, and Winkenbach, he decides to start this. He's a part owner of the Oakland Raiders. The NFL and the AFL, they were growing in popularity. So it was a time when it was more common to have this conversation at bars. It was more common to have this conversation about football in general with friends. So there was also the movement, and you'll see throughout the history of football, it was like this the evolution of stats being recorded were a big part of how fantasy football could evolve and could work. And the first way that we had it for fantasy football was it was really touchdown only, and there were no matchups. So talking about like the formation of the first leagues, it was an 8-team league, and this goes back to like, let's start let's think about starting another league. But it's like the GOPPPL league. The GOPPPL league we can start. And this is how it would run. You would have 2 quarterbacks, 4, this is how old it is. Laugh with me. 4 halfbacks, 2 fullbacks. And this is the full roster that they allowed, and then including bench, and then no one's quite sure what the actual starting lineup was, but 2 quarterbacks, 4 halfbacks, 2 fullbacks, 4 ends. So ends are a wide receiver or tight end.
Got you. Okay.
So a mix of each. It's like a wide receiver, tight end flex. 2 return specialists, 2 place kickers, 2 defensive backs or linebackers flex, 2 defensive linemen. And all that counted was touchdowns. And there were no matchups, to keep it simple in the beginning. They just had the kind of like our playoff, like when we just did no matchups in the playoff league, right? And it was whoever at the end of the playoffs had the most points won. There was no matchups.
No.
So this was the whole season.
Place kickers on the roster, wouldn't field goals have counted?
Yeah, that's the one difference. So it wasn't like, so it counted for a touchdown, a passing or rushing, receiving, any kind of touchdown. But it's the same for passing and rushing and receiving.
Okay.
And it's 25 points. I don't know why it's 25 points, but it's 25 points. Defensive or special teams touchdowns, here's where it changes. It's 25 points.
I'm glad they worked that out.
Yeah. Field goals actually match football. It's 3 points, and it's 1 point for an extra point.
Huh. That's interesting.
So we have 25, and that's all the scoring. That's the whole thing. 25 points, field goal, extra point, 3-1. There's no yardage at all. They only cared about the touchdowns. There was a question, because I know that there's defensive players. There's not information on the scoring for defensive players. I couldn't find anything. Right. There's nothing definitive, and so there's an assumption that there were turnover points. And very, very early, there was probably house rules for different defensive points, but the thought is that it might actually just be that there was defensive players just in case they got a touchdown, and then maybe turnover is a couple points, but they're not quite sure about that. But they were there; they were part of the roster.
Well, when we create the league, we can come up with our own.
Yeah. System for them. When do we do? I like this. Yeah. So the champion was whoever just amassed the most points by the end of the season. It was simple. You draft your thing. There wasn't like, I don't even think in the first few years they even did like a waiver wire trade situation. It was almost like not a best ball, because you set your lineup, and the way they set their lineup in the beginning is that they would call the commissioner by Friday night. You have to call the commissioner and read off to him what your lineup is. He would write it in, and then on Monday, his secretary would total up all of the points and a lot of it had to be listened to, because some teams didn't report as strongly as, so a lot of them were listened to, and then Monday they would total it up, and Tuesday you would get a phone call from the commissioner saying how many points you got that week, which is like easier to deal with when it's not a matchup anyways. So it's not like, did I win or lose this, but like, how many points did I get this week? And you just throw out who you can, and you listen to the games that you can, and then the commissioner confirms.
Imagine what that looked like back then, man. Like the commitment. We can't get people to set their lineups on a weekly basis.
You gotta call in.
Like, imagine that's our goal today. Like, you're looking at the teams in our league, and someone didn't set their lineup. We're literally calling.
Totally.
Set their lineup for them.
Yeah. So the highlight so far is 1963 is the golden year. That's when it started in Oakland, California. And it was started as an 8-team league, NFL players, maybe some AFL players. But just to kind of review of like the NFL team. So at the time we had NFL teams were in the East, we had the Browns, the Cowboys, the Giants. We had Steelers, Eagles, St. Louis Cardinals. We had the Redskins. And then on the West, we had Baltimore Colts, Chicago Bears, Detroit Lions, Green Bay, Packers, the Rams, which had just moved from Cleveland. At that point, the Los Angeles Rams, Minnesota Vikings, San Francisco 49ers. The AFL teams that possibly were part of it, so I'll mention it, but we had the Boston Patriots, the Buffalo Bills, Houston Oilers, New York Jets that became the Titans of New York. And then we had the Denver Broncos, Kansas City Chiefs, which I didn't even realize were that old before doing this. They were the Dallas Texans at that time. Oakland Raiders and San Diego Chargers, which I wish were still the San Diego Chargers.
San Diego Superchargers.
Ooh,
yep.
Mufasa.
Right back then. Yeah, and that would have been like a year after, because they were 1961, I think.
Were they? That's when they...
Angels. I could be mixing that up with my Angels, but I think it's 61.
Are you going to fact check yourself here?
I am fact checking myself.
Good. All right, so likely the rosters were probably, honestly, just one per position is how I would probably play it. We've quarterback, halfback. You would probably have 2 running backs at that point, 1 wide receiver, tight end. But yeah, it being so touchdown heavy makes it like a simpler, I think, throughout the year. And no matchup makes it easier a little bit throughout the year. The manual stat tracking, like when I was listening to it, it's just I assumed that. Obviously there's no that really came about in the 90s when there were some actual platforms that were starting to support this, along with the rise of the internet itself. As zooming or shooting forward here, it was that's when it became easier to manage a league. Before that, it was so manual to make sure you're in a league. So it had to be these hobbyists, it was the sports D&D of the world was fantasy football.
Yeah. So that's really similar to, so in the late 90s, my uncle started a league with a bunch of his his brothers, his cousins. We're Filipinos, so we have a huge family.
Yeah.
So all these folks, and in the 90s, their stats were all from the paper. They just got the newspaper. What were the points or whatever. But the commissioner, one of my uncles, the way that they did it versus calling everybody, because it was all local, to make sure everything was on the up and up, he would drive to each of the person's houses on Monday, review the stats with them, and show them what it was, and give them.
That's a damn good commissioner.
And so that was, I mean, that league is.
He just wanted people to feel good about it, so he actually reviewed everything with them.
Yeah, he would go with the newspaper to go over what their score was, how it came through. I don't know how much they needed him to do that, but I think it was just a part of his process until the uprise of the internet here. But that league is still alive today, and it's got the funkiest scoring stuff going on with it because they came up with it on their own scoring system before there was anything established by ESPN. Yeah, so they just kept their funky scoring system all together.
Do you remember any of what it is?
So, a couple of the things that they do now, and I don't know if this was added later or because they're weird or if it was at the beginning, but running backs don't score any points for yards until they score 100, until they get 100 yards. So very few running backs actually score yardage now because no one runs over 100.
And rushing is the only thing that counts.
Right. Well,
so or is it the running backs? Yeah, but if the running back has a receiving yard of 50 and then 60 rushing, they don't have any of the rushing yardage.
Correct.
It has to be all. Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So they only get the rushing yardage if it's over 100. But that was back, I'm sure that rule came about during the heyday of bell cow backs. And I don't know if they've never I remember Frank Gore being a big deal when they would talk about that rule.
He is infinite.
The ageless wonder of Frank Gore.
Yeah.
So there's funky stuff like that, but I just imagine driving around figuring out your score. And this league has been so elite and local, and one of the fun things about what's come of fantasy football, because They still run today, but it's super exclusive. I'm on the wait list for that league for like 10 years. Like I'm still not in my own uncle's league, like
Dang.
because because of how
What
tight
do
it is.
they
It's a
run it on
16
now?
team 16 team league. I'm not sure. I forget. They meet every year. They do a big draft party. They do a huge after party. They have transaction fees for every trade and um, every waiver pickup. Everything has a transaction fee, and all of those transaction fees go to their draft party the next year. Like, and so they
Oh,
like
cool.
that's how they cater like all their food, and they bring in all their stuff. Like all of it comes from that. So it's like
I
a
love,
super
you know what? One of the things that looking back at like original leagues,
yeah
these grandfather leagues is one of the things that I really wish I had. I mean, you know how many leagues we run together even, and then
right
extra, right? And none of them are live. And I mean, part of it is
yeah
my own fact that I'm transplant from a different area, so a lot of people are in the same area in the leagues. But like, I don't have one league that's like a local draft party league, so I've never actually experienced the draft party itself.
yeah.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Also, consider a co-manager if you get invited to that league and you want a co-manager, just throwing my name in the ring there. I'll fly down. It sounds like a great party.
It's I've never even been to the party, but yeah, it's a great time. It's good food, and they eat well. Like it's super fun. Um,
Just-
and yeah, and the cool thing though that we're talking about with this is like when you had to go through what some of these early leagues and back in the history of time had to go
you had to
through to
want
keep
it.
scores, and yeah, you had to want it, and that built such camaraderie that like those are lifelong friendships. Even if you started in those leagues with people that were just acquaintances, those become your lifelong friendships.
100%. I mean, like for
Yeah,
example, like you and I don't know if we would have had the same. I know we wouldn't have had the same connection, and like stayed in like we were on the same team at work together. We started some leagues together. We ran a work league, and we're still friends now. And we owe it, I think, to fantasy football. And there's, um, I think that especially the originals who are like doing this as like it's Apple in a garage, like it's Google out of a basement. And I'm gonna give a shout out back to the garage days of fantasy football, and I'll give a shout out to his name is Andrew Mousalimas. So it's going to either be um, Bill Winkenbach, so a Winkenbach, or a Mousalimas. But like some fantasy football trophies, I don't know what leagues it's going to be, need to be named after one or both of these dudes. Because the founder of fantasy football, Bill Winkenbach, and the first champion ever of fantasy football is Andrew Mousalimas. I looked it up. I was like, I wonder if he's still alive and if we could like interview him, give him a call, get some of these details that are missing here. And he sadly passed in 2019, of being an old guy and a champion for so many years. He was a champion for years and years and years. And you know what? Champions go hard. So R.I.P. Mousalimas, but like shout out to him. He was the first ever winner of the GOPPPL league.
the
I thought it'd be
Gopple.
cool.
I'm calling. We'll go with the Gopple.
The GOPPPL, yeah. He owned a restaurant in Oakland. He was one of the friends of Winkenbach, and the original league was kind of mixed with just some friends like him and some like
Hmm.
sports writers were a big part of it, of like some just local sports writers of
Okay,
NFL and
so like
AFL,
legit.
and yeah, and so some of them had like the early access to stats in the paper. Some of them were just like fans of football and wanted to try this weird thing out. Um, and yeah, we have Andrew as the first one. So I don't know what one sounds better, but I feel like the Mousalimas has to be or the Moose for short, has to be the name of one of the trophies in one of our leagues to honor the first ever champion.
The Moose, yeah. I like it. I feel like we need to call something the GOPPPL at some point, but we'll figure that out too.
Yes,
Maybe that's
we do.
Maybe
I
that's
think that's the
trophy
league.
champion.
Oh, the GOPPPL. Yeah, maybe that's the trophy. We got to figure that out. The champion, maybe it is the championship round as he made it to the GOPPPL. But
Okay.
like,
Yeah.
there's 3 things we got to honor, and it's the GOPPPL, it's the Winkenbach, and the Moose, and those are ones we got to honor in some way. We got to figure it out because those are 3 legends. And a 4th legend in real football that was a legend in fantasy is Andrew relied heavily on one player. I don't know. I'll give you kind of a guess and see if you could. I don't know if you would guess it, but the first championship team had one player that really defined. And I saw your typing stance go in, so don't cheat.
Yeah.
If you're
I
going
don't
to
even know what
cheat,
I'd look up.
go up like top 20 or top 20 or top 10 most iconic players of the 1963 season. That's as much.
I'm going to tell you 100% that I am not going to get this. My 60s football fandom is
All right, should I give you the first
what it
clue?
could be. Sure.
He was on the Browns.
That doesn't help me. I'm going to fail miserably.
It's the only Browns player you would ever know.
No idea.
All right.
Is his last name Brown?
Yes.
Jim Brown?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. You actually got it. So
I didn't actually cheat on that. That's cool.
Nice. Well played. The first ever championship team, his first pick was Jim Brown. The rumor says. And the rumor is very light on this one, just for the record, but being a Browns fan, I'm just going to go ahead and
You're
give it
gonna run
the
with
nod. I'm going to run with that. Yeah, I'm going to run with that. Considering I heard that like the loser chose a quarterback first once and the winner chose a running back first, and I was like, that's classic fantasy football. Like,
Yeah.
let's go with
Glad
that
that's so
truth.
true today.
Less of a Browns fan move, but like I'm just as a fantasy football fan. But yeah,
Crazy.
Jim Brown was on the first the title winning roster, and he just scored too many touchdowns to mess with it. Because remember, it was only touchdowns at that point. So
Yeah.
I think that player was the only one that got close to the quarterbacks of the time of how many they scored. Because I don't think they had much of an offense, or other than him, he could just run through anybody.
Yeah. I mean, forward passing was obviously a thing at the time, but I think we're still pretty running back heavy anyway back then. So that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's if you look at like I feel like in sports wise, like zooming out to just sports in general at the time, baseball was the classic American game, and at this time, and it was starting to at that time even be overshadowed by football already, even though organized football wasn't that old, where it was like it started with college football. And that's where it started, where people like back in the day when people actually were like just regularly dying on the field. It was like an intense sport. It was a warrior sport.
Right.
And then it moved into this like, let's regulate this thing. And then finally a football team came about in Canton, Ohio. And then this finally started stabilizing in the 50s and 60s to like a legitimate actual sport. And then baseball feels like it was like the taxi company of sports, where it was so popular. And you know how much I hate baseball. You know how much I hate baseball. But it was like the taxi company of sports, where they were, and I think that as you're a baseball fan.
I'm a baseball fan.
And I think you still might agree with me. Let's see. When I say taxi company of sports, they just rested on their laurels, and they just thought like, oh, we got this, we're the top sport. And they didn't embrace things like this. They didn't actually embrace TV, like live TV in the 60s. That's what really took the AFL and NFL and brought it to another level. And
Right.
baseball didn't embrace that right away. They
Yeah.
just thought, oh no, you should be here if you want to watch it, which was
Right.
just not forward thinking. But fantasy was another piece where it was like football hadn't embraced fantasy football yet, but it wasn't until the 80s where anyone even started. Like 20 years after fantasy football was when the first fantasy baseball team, which was called a rotisserie league, because it started in a rotisserie chicken place in New York City. And that's when that started, and then started influencing fantasy football itself too. But at this time, like the only fantasy sport in the world was fantasy football through all of the 60s and then all of the 70s as well.
That's nutty to think about because of how classic a sport baseball is. You would assume that it would have been first to the fantasy spectrum, but you're right, because like even in today's baseball world, they're usually the late adopters to everything, right? So most sports have tried to figure out ways to keep the generations shorter attention span in play, right? More baseball, like regularly, like the pitcher can go out for a sandwich between pitches and keep playing, right? Like, there's no pacing in the game. So they finally started adopting it in the last 2 years, where they have like the pitch clock and everything that they've introduced recently. And your old heads, your traditionalists, are still fighting that.
They don't like it.
Interesting.
And most medium fans, and even people who are like myself, who are just not fans at all, I watch it and I'm like, oh, this is something that I could, like, this makes me want to watch it more, knowing that it might not turn into an 8-hour game, or just like for sure won't be a 3.5 to 5 hour game. You have to evolve with it, and I think I'm a firm believer in, and it's confirmed by fantasy and confirmed by football's interaction with fantasy football over the years, that it wouldn't have been the same sport to the same degree if it wasn't for fantasy football. Like, I'm pretty confident fantasy football made football what it is today.
Yeah, 100%. To its success and to its detriment in some ways for some folks, but yeah, absolutely.
100%. Yeah,
like the amount of money that fantasy football brings to the sport alone, like, is what drives the viewership. It drives the all the way down to player contracts and what teams are able to afford to pay people. Like, it's all plays in.
And I never cared about what another team was doing until I had a player on that team. Like, there was such a change in my understanding of fantasy football. There's like that's a big reason why I'm interested in. I still haven't done a league with like and defensive players.
Right.
And I want to know more about defensive players and understand that side of the ball more. And I just haven't done it because it's really tough, and it's a big adjustment. It's an investment to do that. But it's something that's been on my mind because it took fantasy football for me to be interested in learning about the offensive side on other teams. And I think it would be cool to learn more about it. And that alone kind of like illustrates the point of like how much fantasy football makes people care about elements of football that are outside of their own fandom.
100%. And I mean, I think the greatest thing that has come out of this, though, Arlen, is that, I think you called it out earlier, is that, as we've had immediate access to what fantasy football is, and has given us the ability to create, like, are we at double-digit leagues at this point that we're at least playing in? I don't know.
Close.
I feel like we're close. But I think one of the greatest things that have come out of it is our friendship, Arlen. I think it's true. So,
Yeah.
For all of you out there, we've met each other like twice in real life.
One of my I 100% agree, and there's a lot of friends that I have based on fantasy football, and a lot of friends that I've kept connections with because of fantasy football. In a maybe this is a good like side note of what would you do, but I had a it's gonna be like a somber note for a moment, but I had a buddy of mine in our friend group that we were very close with in high school, and just a really tight friend, and he passed away. He took his own life, and I was playing him that week in fantasy football, and everybody said, this was years ago, so that's why I'm smiling. It's years ago. But everyone said, out of respect to him, let's all bench our players this week. Just no one wins. And I said, but I'm playing him this week. And I had a really big conflict in my head of like, I get what you're doing. I think it's beautiful, but this is my last chance to beat. And it was like this moment where I was like, I'm gonna vote that we don't, because it's my last chance to beat the man.
So I see both sides of the coin. I understood what the league wanted to do. Without my best attempt at not demonizing you in the moment for that time is to say that out of respect for him, I might have wanted to put his best team on the field. Like, just commissioner takes over the team.
That's what happened.
His best possible players, and say, all right, he's going out swinging, and like that's like. You got to get a read for the league. Got to read for how close everyone was, how tight everyone is, and like, and that's a great story to tell. Like, and you got to like, I mean, play it like out of respect for him. We're gonna play out the rest of the season and do the same thing the rest of the way. But
right.
But I think I'd be more in that camp, depending on
of the play him for real.
Yeah, play him for like play him out. But I understand why the league wanted to, like, if it was like a really sad, like,
was a really sad moment, and everybody agreed, and I stepped in and I said, I can't take a knee. They wanted him to be the only winner of the week, which I get.
That's different. Okay.
And I said, I want to play him one more time.
Yeah,
wholeheartedly. I want to beat his ass one more time. Because, like, if he was alive, I would want the same thing. So it was a weird, dodgy moment.
It's like he's living through his fantasy team. So I guess, the way I would, like, look at it is depending on if he was really into fantasy football, like, if he was all about it, and that's, like, a part of, like what you guys knew him for and what he would, like, I would want to play it out. If this was, like, some side thing that he did and enjoying it wasn't, like, he didn't really care about it, I probably would have just killed the league for the week. But out of respect for him, because he was into it and like this was a part of who he was, I'd play it out. But if everyone was more sad, well, obviously
he wasn't like us on it.
Right.
But
there's not a lot of people like us, sir.
No, but I did. The good news is I did beat him. I don't know if it's good news. I kind of wish I lost. I did beat him.
Got it down.
All right. Well,
all over the place. All right.
Cheers to you, Brad. Bradley boy, cheers to you, dedication to you. The next episode, speaking of the history, because we all have history with fantasy football, but the next one of these, and it's not the next episode we'll do necessarily, but the next episode of this series that we'll do of history of fantasy football, we're going to pick up where we left off in the 1960s. So, like, towards the end of the 1960s, when fantasy football was really more niche and centered, really still is local to the Oakland area. There was a big piece that happened that really fundamentally changed it, which is the merger of the AFL and NFL. And it was announced and known in, like, I think 95, 97, but it didn't happen, I think, until 69 or 70. But we'll look at that and, like, how that affected the fanship of it and how that affected fantasy football throughout the 70s, and like what were some of the first experimental things, including, like, spoiler alert, matchups were like one of the first kind of, like, when it got more serious, people started looking at, like, matchups and going head to head and moving on from, like, that touchdown based system, and kind of laid the groundwork for the way I look at it is, like, the 60s were like, let's start it out and see. 70s were like, let's mess around with scoring. The 80s started to be kind of where as they entered the 80s, it was starting to get more structured. There was an expectation to what fantasy sports were. It got its name of fantasy sports in the 80s, mixed with that rotisserie leagues that we talked about, baseball. And then this is where it really started to, like, it was still niche, but it was taken a little bit more seriously, and people knew what it was in the 80s. And I think the 80s was more, it was the detailed statistics that were available, and it was the ability to access those a little bit more easily, helped it spread beyond these like tiny little circles in the greater Oakland area. And then because of the rotisserie format blowing up in the 80s, and I think the next episode will probably focus a little on the 70s and mostly on the 80s, because that's like one of the biggest transition moments that fantasy sports itself, but fantasy football itself had. And that bridge to like this nationwide phenomenon that people started understanding, taking a little bit more seriously, which after the 80s, it was like solidified that this is going to be a thing. And if there is a technology that is easy to connect people from across the country and all over the world, if that technology somehow comes about and it's like interwebbed, then this thing might become bigger than we ever imagined right after that.
Like
So,
the World Wide Web.
like if there's a worldwide web, it might be ready to jump on board.
Quick fact check: Chargers were established in 1960. The same year the Angels were actually established, so both 1960.
Ooh, what did you say before? 63?
I said
61.
61.
You said
I was
one.
off by a year. Yeah.
You were off by a year. That's pretty good. Let's see. 46. Let's just to make you feel better. I'm gonna say 1946 for the Browns, and we'll check it. See, look, 2 years off. 1944, the Browns are founded. I knew I'd be off a little, and you're twice as accurate about your team as mine. That being
I'll
said,
take it.
we'll come back around. It might not be the next episode we do the history on, but we'll do things if you're new here and if you've stuck around this long. We've got fantasy football. We do the dynasty piece. We do rankings. We do all this stuff. Our main focus, which we kind of adjusted. So if you see some of our content, it might paint a different picture. We really kind of broadened over the last like month of like, we want to focus on fantasy football history. We want to focus on like, what would you do as a commissioner? How would you handle this? What are some unique league types that you could do? What are some draft strategies? We want to make people better fantasy football players, and we also want to help brew better leagues. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and subscribe. You can subscribe, follow, whatever platform you're on right now. You can do the thing that means a lot. But the thing that means the most is if you comment and start the conversation with us. We are still, to this day, 100% of our messages to us, our comments to us, our interactions towards us, we have responded to, because we value more than anything the connection that fantasy football brings everybody. Nate, it's been a pleasure. Happy to do this with you yet again, and I'm excited for the next one.
Yeah, I feel super learned. Really appreciate it. Happy to continue to do this and jump right into our next, whatever our next episode brings. Time to nerd out. Later,
got
folks.
learned.
Keep nerding out.
Holler.